Well, Archbishop Viganò issued an amazing interview with Marco Tosatti this week, and I'm joined today with Matt Gaspers. We're going to go through all 10 pages of it with highlights and analysis. I've already done several videos looking at a few statements, but Matt Gaspers is great on this topic and everything Viganò. So he's back, and we're going to go through this, talk about Lando Lakes statement, talk about Pope Francis, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. What does it mean when Viganò says that by the Lord's right hand, it seems that Trump's going to win on November 3rd presidential election? All those things. So, Matt Gaspers, welcome back.
Thanks, Taylor. Appreciate you having me back. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Archbishop Viganò is keeping us both very busy.
Keeping us both very busy, and I was glad, earlier this week, when this interview, we knew this interview was coming out, and you said, hey, let's do one if and when it comes out, and it came out quick. So here it is before us, and we'll get started. But first we will pray. We'll pray the Pater Noster together. Matt, you good for the second half?
Yes, sir.
All right, oremus. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. St. Pius X.
Amen. Pray for us.
All right. Well, this interview, it came out on the Feast of the Holy Cross. Am I right there, Matt?
Yep, Exaltation of the Holy Cross. It was dated 2 days earlier, September 12th, the Feast of the Most Holy Name of Mary. So 2 great feast days, of course.
Yes, great feast days. It's interesting. I was looking up the Feast of Our Lady's name because I was reading in Maria Agreda that Our Lady received her name, Maria, on the octave of her birth. And I thought that's kind of weird because in the church, the name of Mary is not on the octave, but I looked it up. Originally, it was. It's been moved around by a number of popes.
Interesting.
So,
well, I know the current feast relates to the victory of John Sobieski at the Battle of Vienna. So that's exactly a great feast for that reason.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, where do you want to begin with this, Matt? Because this interview, it has so much controversial elements. I mean, Viganò was back ringing the bell on Vatican II.
Yep.
He's linking Vatican II with the summer of '68 and the sexual Marxist revolution. Yep. And then he's tying this 50 years of revolution ultimately into a East-West struggle of China, the Vatican, and America. And the American struggle really right now is over fake Catholic Joe Biden and non-Catholic Donald Trump.
Right. Well, maybe we could start with going a little bit further in depth on the statement that he brings up, the so-called Lando Lakes statement of 1967. I was not actually, I remember hearing about it, but I had never actually read the document myself. So I started going through it in preparation for our show today. And I have to agree 100% with Archbishop Viganò. Vatican II just jumps off the page at me when I read this document. And we can maybe go through a couple of highlights from that to give some examples.
Well, I think if we do that, we need to explain to the audience why the Lando Lakes statement is important and how it relates to Viganò. Maybe we should do that.
Yeah, we can start there.
Okay, let's start there. So do you have that portion of the interview up? I can find it real quick. And if you don't.
Let me see it. Yeah, I have. It's actually basically the first, well, not the first, the second major topic that Viganò discusses. So in answer to, maybe we should just start by recapping Marco Tossatti's original question, the first question to Archbishop Viganò. He says, Your Excellency, you served as Apostolic Nuncio in the United States from 2011 to 2016, and so you know this country very well. And that's kind of the theme of the whole interview, is the upcoming election and the situation of the church in America. So Tosatti goes on, the Democratic candidate Joe Biden claims to be Catholic, but he is in favor of abortion until the 9th month and quote unquote same-sex marriage. is it possible to be Catholic and to oppose the teaching of the church? I think another way is basically asking, how is it possible to even have somebody like Joe Biden in public office claiming to be a Catholic while holding positions that are condemned by the church? So, as you mentioned in your previous broadcasts, Archbishop Viganò begins by answering by sharing a conversation between himself and Pope Francis back in September 2015 when the Pope visited America, asking how can you explain this contradiction about Joe Biden, John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi? And interestingly, Archbishop Viganò says Pope Francis did not react in the slightest, as you mentioned, just as he did not react on June 23rd, 2013, when I revealed to him who Cardinal McCarrick really was. Very interesting. So the second paragraph of Archbishop Viganò's answer to this initial question is when he brings up this document, the Lando Lakes statement, which has some very shady characters who signed that document, including none other than Theodore McCarrick.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah. Who I didn't realize at that time he was a president of a Catholic university. That's insane.
Yeah, at Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonder what he was really up to down there. Yeah. I don't want to know.
Yeah. And for those of you that are not Americans or you failed your geography when you were in high school, Land O'Lakes is Wisconsin.
Correct.
North central U.S.
So what Viganò says in his answer to Marco Tosatti, he says, quote, in 1967, 2 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, another Jesuit, he'd mentioned a Jesuit previously, Father Vincent O'Keefe, whom Bergoglio, as provincial of the Society of Jesus, must have known, as O'Keefe was vicar general under Father Pedro Arrupe, who essentially destroyed the order. Just as a side note, a great treatment of that whole affair is in George Neumeier's book, The Political Pope. He does a good job of tracing the history of the Jesuits and specifically Father Arrupe. So Archbishop Viganò eventually brings up, he says, a document known as the Land O'Lakes Statement, which declared the independence of their, meaning the signatories, Catholic universities and colleges from all authority and all bonds of fidelity to the magisterium of the church. And it literally does that in the preamble. It's crazy.
Yeah, so a lot of people out there, like, the old Jesuit universities that I went to or my grandparents went to, they're thinking about Fordham or help me out. What are some of the other ones? Gonzaga.
I think at Gonzaga. Yeah.
Georgetown,
George Washington.
Even places that, CUA and all, they're like, there used to be Catholic institutions, Notre Dame rather. And now you go there and, they're completely on board with the leftist agenda that you would find at a state school in New Hampshire or LA.
Yep.
And people are thinking, well, how did this happen? Aren't these supposed to be Catholic schools with crucifixes on the walls and no co-ed dorms and Orthodox teaching? Well, what happened was Land O'Lakes.
Yep. And what happened before that, of course, was Marxist infiltration, as you describe in your book. So this document, Land O'Lakes, first of all, this statement about independence from church authority is found actually in the first article or the first paragraph of this document. And this is what it says, quote, the Catholic university must have a true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical, external to the academic community itself. So it's basically declaring independence, as if that's even possible, from the magisterium. They don't want to have any bounds, any bounds constricting them, I guess you could say. But something else I wanted to bring up before we get too much further into the document, the preamble said, I think this really is very telling about the nature of the document as a whole. So it says, The presence of an active participation by persons who are not Catholics in the Catholic university community are most desirable and indeed even necessary to bring authentic universality to the Catholic university itself.
Yeah.
So in my mind, what that means is you need non-Catholics in order to make it Catholic. That's just
ridiculous.
Nonsense.
Ridiculous. Now, is there much more? I don't want to spend too much. We have limited time, Matt. I don't want to spend too much time on Lando Lakes because we have 10 pages of Viganò.
Right.
Is there anything else we need to? We all know that Lando Lakes was a nuclear bomb on Catholic universities. Is there anything else key we need in that?
I think just a couple other things jumped out at me that I'll read real quick, or mention real quick, rather. So the document also mentions connecting it to Vatican II, which is what Archbishop Viganò does. That's why we bring this up. So the document talks about that the theological investigation today, quote, must serve the ecumenical goals of collaboration and unity. Gee, where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
That's Vatican II.
Hard pass.
And it says, same thing, it says this creative dialogue will involve the entire university community. Dialogue is another Vatican II buzzword. So you can just read through this whole document, and to me, Vatican II jumps out on almost every page, almost every paragraph. So I think Archbishop Viganò is spot on in connecting the two.
Yeah, because you have to remember Vatican II promotes ecumenism. That is, we need to include non-Catholic voices to somehow be authentically Christian, Catholic.
Right.
When in 2,000 years have we ever thought that?
Right.
Never. Right? Why do we need a Lutheran's perspective? We don't. That's like saying, well, in the early church they needed some Arians in the universities as well to balance things out. No, we don't. We don't need Arians, Nestorians, any heretics poisoning our minds. In fact, they were all put on an index of forbidden books. You couldn't even read them. Never mind invite them to lecture at your university. Forget that. And then we have this whole idea of religious freedom, which is in Dignitatis Humanae in Vatican II, that people have the right to practice false religions.
And to promote them in public.
So they're saying that God gave a right to Jehovah's Witnesses to promote heresy. Now, we all believe that God gave us a free will, and he permits us to do that. But that doesn't mean you have a right. Like, I have a free will to speed in a child school zone. I don't have the right to do that. Does everybody see the difference there? And Dignitatis Humanae in Vatican II talks about the right to practice and promote a false religion. That's why so many Catholics have had a hard time with that document in the Second Vatican Council.
Right, because the traditional teaching, of course, is that in certain circumstances, in order to mitigate greater evils like public disorder and such, it's acceptable for the Catholic state to tolerate private individuals practicing a false religion in private. It is never licit to give them the so-called right to promote it publicly and lead souls astray.
Right. Correct.
I mean, it's basically there is no equal rights for error. Error has no rights.
Yeah. That's a traditional teaching. But once you get past the 1960s, suddenly you have, in 1986 at Assisi, John Paul II has the Dalai Lama invited into the basilica at Assisi, placing an idol on the altar at the tabernacle. There's a picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
And inviting them to idolatrous worship inside a Catholic church. John Paul II did that in 1986. I know people don't want to hear that. That pushes people out of their comfort zone. But this is the kind of problems that were starting to happen. The cracks were forming. The chasms were forming in 1986. Now in 2019, you have actual idols in St. Peter's, Pachamamas. Right. So this whole thing, this development, Viganò is saying this has been 50 years of revolution. 50 years. It's not just Bergoglio, Pope Francis. No. This has been 50 years. And he talks about, this Lando Lakes. What year was Lando Lakes? Like 67, 68?
67.
So
it
right after the
preceded
council.
68, yeah.
Right after the council. And like, Gaspers, you've seen the picture of the Protestant ministers at Vatican II. right? To help design the liturgy.
Yep.
What's that about?
Not good. But it's in full accord, really, with the Sacrosanctum Concilium, which opens with this statement. I'll read it for you. It's very brief. It says, this kind of a summary of the whole aims of the council in general. So this is the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, the first document promulgated at the council, and it's the only one of the original schemas that survived the trashing of all the original schemas, which
we call it the conciliar slam dunk of the original schema.
Because it's the only one that pleased the modernists enough. So this is how it starts, quote, "This sacred council has several aims in view. It desires to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful, to adapt," that's the key word, "to adapt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ." So right from the start, it's ecumenical in orientation.
Yep. And there is the contested quote by Annibale Bugnini. Different translations of it. I will admit that one translation that I have used before here is a little bit amplified, but basically Bugnini says we need to remove any stones, any stumbling blocks from the liturgies that Protestants would find objectionable. So if there's something that's too invoking Mary too much, or if there's the notion of sacrifice in the Mass, those kind of things, we need to turn those down.
Right.
And again, as a Catholic, I just say hard pass, no thanks. I don't want Protestants telling us what's right and wrong and how to worship because Council of Trent, etc.
Right. Exactly. So one statement of Archbishop Viganò that really stuck out to me that maybe we should spend some time on comes after this section about his discussion with Pope Francis in 2015 in D.C. and then the whole Lando Lakes statement. So Marco Tosatti asks him again, the next question, "Your analysis doesn't stop then at an observation of the current phenomenon, but goes back to its remote causes, behind which there is a mind that has a long-term plan." And that long-term plan ultimately is the Alta Vendita, as you discuss in your book and we've talked about before. But something that Archbishop Viganò says in response to that statement of Tosatti is very significant. He says, quote, "Without Vatican II, we would not have had the student revolution that radically changed life in the Western world, the vision of the family, the role of women, and the very concept of authority." And that's a pretty bold statement. Without the council, we would not have had all of these huge upheavals. And one of those things, the direct connection to the council as far as the vision of the family and the role of women, is definitely the displacing of the primary end of marriage, which of course is the procreation and the education of children. With Vatican II, specifically in the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, which is itself a complete novelty in the history of the Church. It's like, what's the role of the Church in the world right now? Well, it's the same as it's always been.
Right, to save souls and to honor God.
Exactly. So basically, and Professor Roberto De Mattei does a great job of analyzing all of this in his book, The Second Vatican Council, An Unwritten Story. I have my copy right here.
Yep.
And he gave us talk actually a couple years ago, there we go, May 2018.
We basically have the same library sitting next to each other.
That's right. That's right. And that's why I like to bring up these books and show them up and hold them up to people just as a visible reminder, like we have to do our homework.
That's right.
We have to be very well educated lay people at this time in history.
Can't be a lazy Catholic in 2020.
Nope. So in 2018, Professor De Mattei gave a talk called The Two Revolutions of 68. And this is available on the Catholic Family News website, catholicfamilynews.com. And you just type in The Two Revolutions of 68 and you'll find it. And the point of this lecture was basically to talk about the ends. One of the major themes were the ends of marriage. He talks about the first end, being, of course, procreation, the second end, mutual assistance between the spouses, and then the third end, a remedy for concupiscence, a consequence of original sin. And they have to stay in that order in order for marriage to be properly ordered according to God's plan.
Because let's say you say, well, I'm going to switch those around, and I'm going to put procreation and education of children lower down the ladder. Then what happens, people, listen close, is you have LMNOP people who say, well, this is my best friend, my lover, we're helping each other to get to heaven, and we're helping each other avoid concupiscence, which isn't quite true. And yeah, I mean, we can't procreate, but that's not the number one goal. So if procreation and education of children is not the number one goal, then you just open the door to all different kinds of quote unquote marriage. Mm-hmm. It's important that we explain these things to people, because so few of us received a classical education in logic, in philosophy. Yep. You know, I'm going to guess, through no fault of your own, that 90% or plus of the people watching this video have never taken a course on logic. They were never taught fallacies, and we were never taught basic philosophy about natural law. Whereas 200 years ago, people who were educated all had that.
Right.
And that's why when people hear stupid stuff on Netflix or whatever, they can't process it properly because they were never given the right tools.
Exactly. So as Professor De Mattei brings up in this speech of his, again, it's called The Two Revolutions of 68. He quotes from a very significant speech, and he does so in his book as well, given during the council. I think it was during the third session of the council in October of 1964 by a Cardinal Joseph Suenens, not a good actor. Definitely a modernist-minded prelate at the council who was very influential, and whose successor, if I remember correctly, that he wanted to succeed him in the See of Brussels, Belgium, was none other than Cardinal Daniels, who we know is very bad news, of course. So Professor De Mattei talks about, I'm just going to quote a little bit from this speech he gave. At the moment, there were in the church two commissions which worked on the family and marriage. The first was the commission which prepared the Constitution Gaudium et Spes. That, again, is the Constitution on the church in the modern world. De Mattei goes on, the second was an ad hoc commission suggested by Suenens himself to John the 23rd to study the problem of birth control. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't realize that there was a commission during the pontificate of John the 23rd, the Pope who opened Vatican II, to discuss or to study this issue, this problem of birth control. And then the commission continued into the pontificate of Pope Paul VI. So he talks in this Cardinal Suenens speech, he says, quote, it may be, this is Cardinal Suenens speaking, it may be that we have overstressed the words of Scripture, increase and multiply, to the point of leaving in the shadows the other divine words, and the two shall be in one flesh. So what he's getting at is he's trying to displace the primary end of marriage, which is ultimately what happened, which is what led to the revolution of birth control. I mean, I don't know what the current statistics are, but I think they're pretty abysmal. Most Catholics, most self-identifying Catholics who are married or even not married, I guess, are contracepting. Yeah. That's how we got here, by displacing the primary end of marriage.
Yep. And that's what, in Viganò, he's talking about the revolution of 68. And, in America, what images come to mind when you think of the revolution of 68? I think of, hippies and burning bras and Woodstock and, the music. You're kind of in peak Beatles. I don't know what 68 is. That White Album? Is that Hey Jude? I don't know. But, you're getting into that. You're getting into the advent of the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix, and it's kind of the peak psychedelic, and then after 68, 69, things start to get a little bit more darker, and you move into like Black Sabbath, and you have horror films kind of taking over the theaters, and there's definitely a shift in what was considered to be decent and wholesome and good. That's all lost. And one of the things Viganò says in this lesson is, or in this interview rather, there was already a rebellion brewing, but in the moment of the greatest rebellion, the church, who is like a parent, a father or mother, basically said, you know what, we're not going to be hierarchical anymore. We're not going to be absolute. We're not going to be magisterial. You guys just follow your own conscience. It's like telling a rebellious teenager, just follow your heart, kid. And that's not good parenting.
No.
that
Definitely
spins.
Not.
A young person really wants to know, do you love me, and are there boundaries? Are there fences that I'm not allowed to cross? And are you going to really hold me to that? Is it really serious to you? That's
right.
That's what everyone says teenagers need. And this was sort of a teenage rebellion in society. And the church, for the first time in history, I'm thinking here, I mean, Roberto de Mattei could tell us better. First time in history, churches said, you be you.
Right. It was the first time that the church enabled something like this.
Yeah.
And beginning with, and I know you discussed this in one of your broadcasts on this text from yesterday, or maybe it was earlier today, about the opening speech of John the 23rd, by which he opened the council. That's where it started, right there.
Yeah,
all of this language about the world is so wonderful. We're entering into a new. He actually says a new order of things. I mean, it's reminiscent of like the New World Order kind of stuff. It's crazy.
He says, "Let us not listen to the prophets of doom."
Yep.
And it's ironic that just when there was all this optimism in the early 60s, that we are on the precipice of all this ungodly revolution.
Right.
That human nature, in 1962, was human nature suddenly better than it was after Adam and Eve fell? No, it was the same human nature, the same problems.
Yep. I think something else that you've talked about a lot in reference to this interview is the connection to communism, which is also directly goes back to probably the single most egregious failure of the council, one of them anyway, the complete omission of the condemnation of communism.
Yes.
Another book that I reference a lot when I come on your show, The Great Facade, Chris Ferrara and Tom Woods. This is what he says regarding that omission on the part of the council. So first of all, a lot of people don't know, I'm sure a lot of viewers don't know, that there was actually a secret Vatican-Moscow agreement that was negotiated. You probably bring this up in Infiltration. I can't remember offhand. But it was called the Metz Pact, M-E-T-Z. And it was negotiated between Cardinal Tisserant, who was, I think, the Vatican, I don't know if he was the Vatican Secretary of State at that time, but he was I think he was in the Secretariat of State, and the Orthodox Metropolitan Nicodim, who was actually, as we know now from testimony from KGB defectors, he was himself a KGB agent. Mm-hmm. The Russian Orthodox hierarchy, unfortunately, was infiltrated very thoroughly by the KGB.
Yes, indeed.
They were basically just the so-called religious arm of the Soviet state. So so Chris Ferrara and Thomas Woods, in their second chapter of their book, The Great Facade, they talk about the irony of specifically Gaudium et Spes. So that document has problems not only for displacing or giving the impression that the primary end of marriage is no longer procreation and education, but also the mutual good of the spouses. Not only does it have that problem, it also refuses to condemn explicitly the main problem of the so-called modern world, which is communism. Here's how they say it in here. So the council that met to discuss the problems of, quote, the modern world preposterously failed to mention the biggest problem of all, communism. the worst form of systematized evil in human history, which was devouring Catholics by the millions at the very moment the council began. End quote.
Yeah, I mean, you think about what plagued the world in the 50s and into the 60s, and you think of Russia, you think of China and Chairman Mao, you think of its spread to North Korea, Vietnam, and then to Cuba to encroach on American shores. And that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was on everyone's mind. It's a great evil. And yet, the church said publicly, nothing.
And for those of you who are probably wondering why in the world did the church not condemn communism, the reason is through this secret agreement. Pope John the 23rd basically exchanged silence on communism so as to not offend the Soviets in order to have Russian Orthodox observers
at Second Vatican Council.
Right. Who were, as Ferrara and his co-author mentioned, basically KGB agents in black robes. Like, we got nothing out of the deal at all.
And, let's rewind here, Matt. You and I have talked a lot about Third Secret of Fatima.
Yes.
But building up into the Third Secret of Fatima is the teaching that Russia will spread her errors throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're talking about here is Marxist atheistic communism. And how could it be that Our Lady would come to earth in 1917 and explicitly warn us of the Russian errors? And then, just a few decades later, after the Russian errors have spread and taken so many lives in Russia and China and elsewhere, and the church zips her mouth closed.
Yep.
And says, we're in a new era? Don't listen to the prophets of doom? Hello? Look at what happened between 1917 and 1960 in communist countries, in the advanced growth of communism around the globe.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's crucial for people to understand now that here in 2020 is that in the mind of Pope Francis, and he makes this very clear repeatedly, he sees continuity between himself and the Second Vatican Council. People have to understand that. He does not see himself as going off the rails of Vatican II. He sees himself as the natural fulfillment of the council.
Yes.
He says it over and over in his speeches, in his documents. So for those who claim that the problem is simply Pope Francis, they're not listening to Pope Francis.
Right.
They're not hearing what the man is saying, that he sees himself as the logical conclusion of the council.
Yep. Now, what do you make of the Viganò statements? And Tosatti asks him explicitly that you're making he says, Marco Tosatti says the exact question, why do you see a relationship between the Second Vatican Council and the 1968 student protests? And he mentions how Jesuit and Dominican priests were out there in the barricades leading this revolt. And he talks about something that I'd never heard of before, and that is what he calls a landmark in salvation history, according to them, of intercommunion at an ecumenical mass. So this is in 1968, May 1968 in France. So the idea here is that we're entering into a new age of Christianity, a new Pentecost, where believers of all different sects and denominations engage in intercommunion. So doctrine no longer matters. This is 68. Remember, Vatican II ended in 1965. So we're 3 years later. And so Viganò says, no, these things are definitely connected. He quotes Father René Laurentin, who says, the demands of May 68 movement largely coincided with the Council's grand ideas, particularly in the Council's constitution on the church and the world, as you just said, Matt.
Yep.
To a certain extent, Vatican II was already a protest against the Curia by a group of bishops who were trying to create an institutionally prefabricated council end quote.
Right. And this, I just remembered a quote I wanted to mention, something else from The Great Facade, which Chris Ferrara and Tom Woods bring up, and many people have quoted over the years, but it's very significant. They say that Cardinal Ratzinger openly admits that Dignitatis Humanae, which again is the decree, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, together with Gaudium et Spes, which is the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, is, quote, and this is Ratzinger speaking, a counter syllabus, a revision of the syllabus of Pius IX, which corrects the so-called one-sidedness of the position adopted by the Church under Pius IX and Pius X. So that's a huge admission on the part of Ratzinger.
And he's talking about, so people know, the syllabus of errors by Pius IX. He lists errors that must be condemned. And so Benedict XVI is saying, we created 2 new documents that are against a previous document in the Magisterium. How is this possible? And
yet, he still wants us to think that there can be a hermeneutic of continuity. You were talking about logic earlier. Folks, right. That is not logical. Right. That is asking you to violate the principle of non-contradiction. There's just no way around it.
Yeah. How can you say that these 2 documents create a counter syllabus of errors, which is a magisterial document, and say, but it's in continuity?
Right.
If it's against the previous document, it's not in continuity with the previous document. And this is why in 2020, we're having this conversation of whether there's a hermeneutic of continuity, or, and hermeneutic, by the way, means interpretation. So do we interpret Vatican II in continuity with the previous church documents, or do we see them as a break from the previous church documents? More and more people, like myself, like Matt Gaspers, like Archbishop Viganò, like Bishop Schneider, and even I think I've seen statements of Cardinal Burke and Brandmüller saying there is problems in the text, not just weaponized ambiguity, actual problems, like that Muslims adore God nobiscum, with us. Nobiscum means with us. Is it true that Muslims adore God with us? No, it's not. So I reject that statement in Vatican II.
Yep. Because as Bishop Schneider says, and again, I highly recommend this book. I know you have as well, but if folks haven't read his book, Christus Vincit, yet, definitely that's required reading in 2020.
Gotta read it.
Especially the chapter on Vatican II. It's brilliant. It's brilliant work.
Fantastic book. And the first 2 chapters will make you cry. Reading about him growing up with his holy family, his holy mother and father, and how they would travel hours to find a mass under communist persecution. Beautiful.
But what Bishop Schneider emphasizes specifically regarding the council is that the church has never and still does not require us to hold 2 mutually exclusive things as both being true. The faith does not require us to violate reason.
Right.
He talks about the squaring of the circle. That's not what the church or God expects of us.
Yep.
If something is false, it's false. And you don't have to believe that it's true based on a misunderstanding of magisterial authority.
Right. What did you think about his statement a little bit below there? He said, without a green light from the church, the world would never have accepted or taken up the student movement's demand for rebellion. Beyond the acts of the council, it was precisely the spirit of Vatican II that marked the end of a hierarchically constituted society and of the traditional values common to the Western world. Until then, concepts such as authority, honor, respect for the elderly, a spirit of mortification and service, a sense of duty, the defense of the family in one's fatherland were shared and, albeit in a weakened form, compared to the past, still practiced. So people still respected their elders. They understand that their life was supposed to have service involved in it. It wasn't just about narcissism and pleasing myself and my passions. All those things, even though Christendom had been broken by the 1900s, all those things were retained in culture, in society. And then when this rebellion happened, it was at that very moment that the church said, like we mentioned before, as a parent, you be you, follow your heart,
My
whatever.
first thought in response to that is I think a lot of it had to do, and much more than people realize, with the destruction of the traditional liturgy, because all of those things are inculcated in the traditional mass.
Yep.
And they're also all either implicitly or sometimes even explicitly attacked in the new mass. Respect for authority. That's a good way to describe the new mass. You be you, Father. You be
Yeah.
you.
You be you. You decide. It's interesting. One of my critics on social media this past week was criticizing me, and here was his criticism. You tell me what's wrong with this, Matt Gaspers. He said, Taylor Marshall says, that when all these documents came out that, Gaudium et Spes, Dignitate Humanae, Nostra Aetate, all these documents, people began to lose their faith and stopped attending church. Well, that's wrong, because we know for a fact that the lay people, in the beginning in 1965 through 1975, they weren't reading the documents of Vatican II. So how are they losing their faith? If from 1965 to 1975, how can you claim that church attendance went down because of Vatican II? Marshall's an idiot. He doesn't realize that the lay people were attending the Novus Ordo for the first time. First, it started changing in 1965, and then the new mass was promulgated in 69 and in place by 1970. Well, this guy who's criticizing me, doesn't he understand that, of course, the lay people didn't read the documents of Vatican II.
Right.
But Vatican II changed all 7 sacraments, and that sent the lay people into a tailspin, and they began to lose their faith.
Right.
Maybe.
It's amazing that's just displays a profound ignorance on the part of whoever that is,
right,
about the history, or they're just being dishonest. I think those are the only 2 options.
But I mean, it pulls up your point of the liturgy.
That's most people's experience throughout church history. That's one of the primary means of being catechized throughout church history, is simply attending divine liturgy.
Yep.
And you can't, so as I wrote a few years ago for Catholic Family News, I did a series of articles on looking at this issue of continuity or rupture, the hermeneutic of continuity, examining Vatican II in light of tradition. And in my article on the liturgy, I focus on the traditional axiom lex orandi, lex credendi, which loosely translated means the law of prayer is the law of belief. You cannot radically change the lex orandi of the church, the experience of the faithful on a weekly basis, and expect there to be no change to the law of their belief.
Right.
That is simply not reasonable. If you radically change the law of prayer, there is going to be a change in people's beliefs.
Yep.
That's just how it works.
Yeah, if you receive communion on the tongue for 10 years, and then you receive communion on the hand for 10 years, your perception of the Eucharist will change. I'm sorry. It will. It will definitely change the way you understand the Eucharist, because we are physical, tangible people. Our experience and our understanding of reality is related to our 5 senses. I eat tacos with my hand, nachos, burgers, French fries, pick it up, put it in my mouth all the time. No big deal. Never, except for when I was an infant, has someone at the restaurant walked up and placed food inside my mouth. That'd be kind of weird.
Absolutely right.
But when we reverse it and we say, well, we used to have someone put the food directly in our mouth, and now we just pick it up like a French fry. But that wouldn't change any belief or our reverence towards the Eucharist. Of course not. What? You really believe that? You really believe communion? All the Protestant reformers, 100% of the Protestants in the 1500s, they promoted communion in the hand in order to break the belief, the superstition of transubstantiation. They said if you put communion in people's hands, they'll stop believing in the papist myth that it's really the body of Christ. All the Protestants taught that. They knew that. And yet
Even
somehow
the phrase, I think the phrase "hocus pocus" is like a mockery of "hoc est enim corpus meum,"
it
the
is.
words of consecration.
It is. So they were mocking the real presence by having communion in the hand in the 1500s. Somehow, people in 2020 are still arguing that you can put communion in people's hands and it won't erode their faith in transubstantiation in the Eucharist. It's just not true.
Right. And, another objection that we should probably answer, because people have raised it recently, is, well, Vatican II never said anything about communion in the hand. Technically, that is true. Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy, did not say anything about communion in the hand. However, that's not the whole story. Although it was unlawfully introduced in Europe in the 1960s, and it was illicitly fostered by members of the sacred hierarchy, and ultimately, it was Pope Paul VI, the Pope who signed all the documents of Vatican II, who capitulated to that rebellion and began granting indults.
Yep.
So I don't want to hear anybody else saying anymore that, well, this had nothing to do with the council and it wasn't the Pope's fault. It absolutely was.
Yes.
The buck stops with him, and he refused to put his foot down as a good father and say, no, we are not going to do this, period. Even though, and this is what makes it even all the more amazing, is that there was a clear majority of bishops around the world who voted, when he asked them, they voted to retain the traditional practice, and yet he still went along with the rebellion.
Yep. If you have infiltration, at the back of the book, I actually did a timeline on communion in the hand, because people are very confused on how we got communion in the hand. And the very first indult to officially allow communion in the hand was made for the nations of Holland, Belgium, France, and Germany on May 29th, 1969.
So before the Novus Ordo had even been introduced.
So the Novus Ordo was promulgated in 69. I don't know. I can't remember which month. And it was made present to the local parishes all over the world in 1970. So before people saw the Novus Ordo, Pope Paul VI had already allowed communion in the hand. And then it's on page 291 if you want to look. But in 1970, South Africa, Canada received permission. 1971, Rhodesia. 74, Zambia. New Zealand. 75, Australia. 76, England and Wales. Papua New Guinea. Ireland. Pakistan. And then here in the United States, we got it in 1977. But
thanks largely due to Cardinal Joseph Bernardine, who's very bad news, obviously.
Very bad indeed. So the man who closed the council, and the Pope who closed the council and signed all the documents, Paul VI, is the same guy who signed all those indults allowing communion in the hand. And we've also seen, you can watch the video on YouTube, the guy takes the black glove and he takes unconsecrated hosts, 10 communions in the hand, and then studies the gloves. Have you seen this, Matt?
I've heard of that study done. He wanted to see how many particles remained on the hands.
Do you know how many he found?
More than you would think.
108 particles.
Wow. From how many communions?
10 communions in the hand.
Wow.
So this is sacrilege. Every single particle of the Eucharist has the whole Christ, body, blood, soul, divinity.
Yep.
So these particles are falling on the carpet and you're stepping on them. This is one thing I say, Matt Gaspers, to people who are like, well, I don't want to be tratty. I don't want to go to the Latin Mass. People are weird. People are mean, etc. I just say, look, let's suspend that and bracket that. At the Novus Ordo, if there's communion on the hand, and after 10 communions, 108 particles fall from the host, that means that even though you're not receiving communion in the hand, you're likely walking on particles. You're walking on the Eucharist. Are you okay with that? No, I'm not okay with that. Okay, you need to go to a church where the Eucharist is 100% of the time administered on the knees, in the mouth, with the communion paten under the chin, just in case. You have to go to that parish. And most of the times, the only parish that offers that is where? Traditional Latin Mass.
Yep.
That's a workaround argument right there.
There you go. There you go.
Viganò. He talked about George Soros. He talked about
that, yep.
Biden. He talked about Trump. What do you think about Viganò's foray into politics? This was especially in the second half, he gets very much into American politics and then sort of the George Soros open society globalism. What's your take on that? I've kind of shared my thoughts in the last 2 days. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is something that's going to be coming up more and more as we get closer to the election. I've had a couple engagements on social media with folks saying, yeah, obviously you can't support Joe Biden if you're a true Catholic, but how can you support Donald Trump based on his personal past? And I don't think either of us think that he's perfect on all of his public policies either. But obviously, he's the clear choice when you're facing the demons on the other side. So I actually have we're working on assembling the October paper right now for Catholic Family News, and my superior at the paper, Dr. Brian McCall, decided to write a really thought-provoking article comparing Trump to Constantine, because a lot of people. Constantine, I think we have a tendency to idealize him in our minds and forget some of the actual history, which is what Dr. McCall goes into in his article, saying that, Constantine was far from perfect himself. He did not practice monogamy. Unfortunately, in his personal life, he had more than one woman, not at the same time necessarily, but he didn't recognize the indissolubility of marriage. As one example, he was actually fairly tolerant of paganism, of false religions, but as well as recognizing the liberty of the church. So in other words, long story short, he had his imperfections. But Dr. McCall argues in his article, I won't reveal all of it because it hasn't been published yet, but basically that just because Constantine wasn't perfect, he wasn't a St. Louis IX, for example. The church did not eschew him and say, well, we can't have anything to do with you because you're not an integrally Catholic leader.
Right.
The church recognized that she had a very, perhaps an unlikely friend in the emperor, and she used that, or she accepted that hand of friendship, and ultimately it had drastic consequences for all of Western civilization in the centuries that followed. Constantine did not found Christendom, but he made the circumstances, or he together, in cooperation with the church, he made Christendom possible to flourish in the centuries that followed. So there's an interesting comparison between Constantine and President Trump that I think Catholics need to consider seriously, especially if they're tempted to say, well, what's the point of voting?
Right.
There's a huge point to voting, especially in this election.
And let's be honest, even for us Catholics, other than the Blessed Mother, the Pure Theotokos, and our Lord, all of us, even King Louis IX, the saint, we all have sins. Venial sins at least, perhaps mortal sins. None of us are perfect. Even the great saints have great faults. And when we vote for a president, we are not voting for a bishop or for a saint. It's not a vote on, is he a good man or should he be canonized? It is a vote on, we have a job that requires leadership, and who is the best person. It's kind of like, I've used this analogy before, let's say I have a broken toilet and my house is flooding.
Right.
And two guys show up. There's two plumbers in town, right? I don't really care which one is Catholic. I want the best one and hopefully the least expensive one. Hopefully that's the same guy. It usually isn't. But I want the best plumber so that I don't have toxic waste in my home. So my home is a safe and pleasant place to be.
Right.
That's the decision. And so many people think, well, it's kind of like, well, does your plumber pray the rosary? When was the last time he went to confession? It doesn't matter. Ideally, I'd like a plumber who wears the brown scapular, prays the rosary, etc., right? Prays the divine office, and he's an awesome plumber. I would choose that guy, always.
Right.
But we live in America, and there's a two-party system, and you only have two choices this November: Joe Biden and Donald Trump, period. And the church has always said, if you live in a republic, you have a moral obligation to vote.
Yes.
You
and
hire
to use
hire
your
the
vote,
best plumber.
Use your vote to restrain the most amount of evil. And we have another article, front page, very thorough treatment of, it's basically just called Trump versus Biden. For faithful Catholics, the choice is clear, and it's crystal clear. There should be no question in anyone's mind as to who they have the obligation to vote for to restrain the most amount of evil. It's undeniable.
Yep. Now, so let's jump to the end. We're kind of getting to the end of our time here, Matt. What did you think about the closing? It's really the closing, about 6 to 7 paragraphs where he starts quoting Trump and the GOP convention. He said, which the GOP convention was awesome. We had Sister Deidre. We had Abby Johnson gave just an amazing speech. But he says, Viganò says, allow me to recall the words of President Trump at the end of the recent Republican National Convention. Quote, our opponents say that redemption for you can only come from giving power to them. In other words, Biden, the communists, the secularists, you can only get redemption not from God, not from Jesus Christ, not from the sacraments, but by giving us more power. You give us more power, we'll redeem you. What a lie.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And then he says, the darkness and chaos we see in American cities are the fruit of the same ideology that approves of postnatal abortion and homosexual marriage, just as the backers of the BLM and Antifa movements are precisely the Democrats and the philanthropic foundations that furiously oppose Trump's reelection. And then he goes on, he starts quoting John Paul II. What do you think of that, Matt?
That was interesting. What does he say here? Do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Help the Pope and all those who wish to serve Christ, and with Christ's power to serve the human person and the whole of mankind. I love that he picked up President Trump's quote and gave the full quote, because I guess I had either missed that or had forgotten it, but it's powerful. I mean, this is the President of the United States saying these words publicly. Quote, our opponents say that redemption for you can only come from giving power to them. But in this country, we don't turn to career politicians for salvation. In America, we don't turn to government to restore our souls. We put our faith in Almighty God. End quote.
Amazing. That's a
so
great
again,
quote. Yeah, it's a great
is
quote.
President Trump the Constantine of our time? I think it's a question that we need to consider.
Right. And then the amazing quote that Viganò follows up right after the quote you just read, Matt. He says, this is Viganò speaking for himself, I believe that this faith in God, which clearly must be matched by a consistency of Christian life and witness, will also confirm in the 2020 U.S. presidential election that the Lord's right hand has done mighty things, as Psalm 117 reminds us, which is pointing towards a victory for Donald J. Trump.
I think this 2020 election, as we start wrapping up, is definitely a battle of the Milvian Bridge moment in American history. This is huge.
Tell people what the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is.
Right. So in late October in the year 312, Constantine had already been proclaimed emperor of part of the realm, if I remember the history correctly, but he wasn't the sole Roman emperor. He had rivals. And I can't remember the name of the rival that he was facing. I think, was it Max?
Well, there's Maxentius and Maximian. I can't remember which one is which here.
One of the two.
You keep talking and I'll look it up.
Okay. So he was opposing one of those two rivals in order to gain more legitimacy for his reign. And they met they were preparing for battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. I think that bridge is in Rome, if I remember correctly.
Well, it's a rebuilt one, but yeah, you can
exactly.
go to it. Yep.
So Eusebius, the great church historian, records a lot of this history in his works, and he explains that I think it was
Maxentius.
The night before. Maxentius?
Yep.
Okay, there we go. Hang on, I'm going to pull up. We published an article on this a couple years ago. I'm just going to get the history from that there. So Constantine, I'll just read from this article we published back in 2018 originally. Constantine also sought divine counsel before the battle, and he received a sign from the one true God. The stories vary on details of his visions, or if it was a dream instead of a vision, but ultimately he saw a vision, or in either a dream or a vision, of the words in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, which means conquer by this sign. And he saw next to those words the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. And Eusebius explains at this sight, Constantine himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition and witnessed the miracle. I'll wait for.
No, you keep
talking. Like you got some. Oh, okay.
Talking.
So, as this article that CFN published a couple years ago, there were precious few Christians in Constantine's army, but nonetheless, he ordered that the sign of the cross, or also the Chi Rho symbol, the first two Greek letters in the name Christos, the Chi and the Rho, had those painted on the standards and on the shields of the soldiers, and they went into battle. I think it was October 28th, 312, and they routed Maxentius in that battle. And Constantine, as a result, publicly attributed the victory to the God of the Christians, in other words, the one true God. Yep. So that's what we're looking at here in 2020 with this presidential election. It really is, as Archbishop Viganò says so well, the children of light versus the children of darkness, good versus evil, serious business.
You know, I kind of had chills because the battle was October 28th. And the election is November 3rd. So we should pray that something big happens on October 28th.
Yes.
That'd be good. All right. So I got up for the first time. I think I've never stood up in a video, I think, ever. But that was my first time. And I wanted to do a quick commercial because I wasn't planning on this, but I wrote a 3-part trilogy on Constantine. And
That's awesome.
And St. George. And I think you'll really love it, especially if you're into history. It's historical fiction. But it tells the story of St. George, St. George and the Dragon. But the other main character throughout all 3 books is Constantine, and the book ends with Constantine. It has Constantine, Helena, George, St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Nicholas, who becomes Santa Claus. All these people live at the same time. The book begins in 299 and ends in 303, and it kind of sets up a conversion sequence for Constantine. So if you're interested in Constantine, you want a good Catholic novel, check out my trilogy, Sword and Serpent.
Sweet.
Well, that's the end of the Viganò statement. It's 10 pages. Everybody should read it. I had breakfast with a priest this morning, and he hadn't read it. And I said, "You haven't read it? Come on. This is amazing. You got to read it if you want to understand." It's very interesting. I've read everything Viganò's ever written since 2018, many times. And I feel like I really understand his thesis. I almost call this video the Viganò thesis because he's tying together all of these global manifestations into a single narrative. Some people might call that a conspiracy theory. I think it's genius.
Yeah.
And I think he's in a very unique position, having worked in the Vatican City with regard to the Vatican Bank, being close to Pope Ben XVI, then being the ambassador to the United States of America, the papal nuncio, right before all of this sludge came out into the public, and he helped bring it. He was really a linchpin in America between Benedict XVI and Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm.
God has placed Viganò in a international and geographical and political position that no one else on earth has. Viganò has a special history with Rome and with America. And so I think more than anyone alive, he is able to speak to this. You know, it's very interesting, Matt Gaspers, when everything came out with McCarrick, there's a video clip, which I think has been scrubbed from the internet by Bishop Robert Barron. And Bishop Barron, in this soundbite, says, well, the only way we're going to figure all this out is if we contact Archbishop Viganò, because he was nuncio during this time. This was before everything started getting real heavy with Viganò. Now, right. Bishop Barron and the other bishops aren't saying, hey, let's call up Viganò and he'll help us out, because Viganò has helped us out. And he's said a lot more than I think they were expecting for him to say.
Because you got that right.
He's knocking down the whole house of cards.
He's knocking down the great facade of the council.
The great facade. And, you know, someone asked me, they said, you know what? What's the end game of Viganò? Why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? And I think I have an insight to that. And it goes back to his first original statements where he says, I'm an old man. And there is a concern in his heart for his own salvation. That he wants.
I think he understands the stakes that are at play here. That he has God has chosen him for this role for such a time as this, as the book of Esther says.
Yes.
And he understands the stakes involved. Yes. This is very serious business.
I agree. And I think, you know, he's been chosen for this time. I think he knows it. And I think he knows if he doesn't correspond with the graces, it's just like St. Paul says, woe is me.
Right.
You know, if I preach the gospel and go out to all these lands and I don't finish the race. I don't finish the race. And, you know, I think Viganò knows, just like all of us, when we look back on our life, oh, I should have said something there. I would do that differently. I regret that. We all have those moments. And he's in a very unique position to vocally make right the wrongs and to bring about clarity. And I think he is doing that. And I think he does it from a spirit of charity towards Christ and towards his neighbors. And in his case, his neighbors are the people that live in the Vatican walls.
Yep. And charity, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, charity does not rejoice with wickedness or iniquity, but rejoices with the truth.
Yes.
That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
He is on a campaign to simply tell the truth.
Yeah.
And those who mock him, calling him a tired old crank, better seriously examine their conscience. That's
cool. That happened this week.
Right.
Oh, we'll call names. Sorab. How do you say his last name?
I can't remember offhand. Abram, I think, something like that.
Soram Abram. He called Viganò a tiresome old crank. He doesn't know. He doesn't know Viganò. We know Viganò. That's not Viganò. Viganò is a cheerful, happy man who loves Christ and loves the church. I can testify to that personally. He is a joyful and happy man, not an old crank. Not an old crank. Well, there's a great show. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll close in our prayer. And if you enjoyed this and you benefited from it, I really enjoyed being back with you, Matt. It was fun.
Yes, it was. Thanks for having me. We're gonna have lots more to discuss in the coming weeks and months. Pope Francis, as you know, has a new encyclical that he's going to be signing on October 3rd, and it was just announced today by the Vatican that it's going to be published and made available on October 4th, the 1-year anniversary of the Pachamama.
Was it the 4th or the 7th?
I think it was the 4th. The Feast of St. Francis of Assisi.
Killer.
So we're going to have to get together again and dissect that
anniversary. Document. Yeah, we got to get after that. We got to get after that. So that's a reminder. If you're not subscribed, why aren't you subscribed? Subscribe to the Taylor Marshall Podcast. Subscribe also to the Catholic Family News channel. Matt Gaspers and Brian McCall do a weekly roundup. What day does that come out, Matt?
Usually on Friday afternoon, Friday evening is when we post that. Yeah.
Hence weekly wrap up, right?
Yep.
So make sure you subscribe over on that channel, subscribe to this channel, Dr. Taylor Marshall, and hit the bell to get notified. And there's a little trick to this. If you hit the bell and you're on a phone, you have to also turn your notifications on for YouTube on your phone, or you won't get the notification. And then please share this video. As I've been saying for the past couple of weeks, you're probably tired of me talking about it, but YouTube is throttling all videos that talk about Trump, Biden, etc., LMNOP, the A word, all the kind of stuff that we talk about, all those topics. And yes, the YouTube bots actually listen to what we're saying and get the words and find keywords. So when we say it, that's why you hear me say LMNOP, because I'm not saying the other. I'm avoiding the bots. So these things get throttled and they get killed within the YouTube landscape. So the way you can help me and you can help Gaspers and any other conservative commentator who's making video content is you have to share this video. So next to the thumbs up is the share button. Anytime you watch a video you think is good, that people need to hear, you need to share it with your family and friends on Twitter and Facebook. Facebook is the best. So please, when you watch these videos, please hit the share button and share it everywhere. And please like it, hit the thumbs up. Okay, yes. We're going to pray the Ave Maria and the Gloria Patri. Who should we pray this for, Matt? I think Viganò, but we can add, or what do you think?
I think definitely for Viganò and for all those who are, I don't know, maybe sitting on the fence regarding a full return to tradition, that they're maybe nervous about going to the traditional Latin Mass, just to take courage, take heart. Yeah. And I pray regularly for those of us who already are in tradition. As I mentioned last time I was on the show, that we really need to have profound humility and intense charity, especially toward those who don't already attend. We need to be the, as you say, or as our Lord says, the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Yeah. We really need to be not in a Vatican II kind of mushy sense of being welcoming, but truly being welcoming. Right.
I agree. And you know what? If you are kind of afraid to go to the Latin Mass, if you're a woman, like, do I wear one of those veils? Will I be kind of weird? What if I don't know what to do? I don't know Latin. What if I'm sitting when they're standing or standing when they're sitting? I'd really encourage you to go and watch the interview I did with Abby Johnson.
Oh, it was awesome.
Abby Johnson, she spoke at the Republican convention, and she's been attending the traditional Latin Mass. And Abby Johnson is just very frank and very clear. And her perspective on attending the Latin Mass, you know, as a newbie, is very refreshing. It's fun. I share some of my own experiences, good and bad. And I think if you go and listen to that interview with Abby Johnson, I think it's a long interview. The first half is her talking about her talking at the Republican convention. The second half is her talking about attending the Latin Mass. So if you want to, you can jump to that second half. But I think it's really good. Did you watch that, Matt?
I did, yeah. And her candor and her humor just puts you at ease. She's such a good speaker. She just seems like such a genuine, good person. Yeah. Great interview.
Yeah. So go watch that with Abby Johnson. I think that'll really, if you're new to the Latin Mass, I think her interview will really kind of take your guard down and help you out. So speaking of Latin Mass, let's pray in Latin, Matt.
All right.
Ave Maria and Gloria Patri. Oremus.
Sounds good.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Amen. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. You know, one of the reasons why we pray these three prayers, the Pater Noster, Ave Maria, and Gloria Patri, is to help encourage you to pray the Rosary in Latin. You don't have to. I actually pray 7 days a week. I pray the Rosary in English with my family because we have little kids and all that. We do pray sometimes in Latin, but usually not the whole Rosary. But if I'm by myself or with other people, I will pray the Rosary in Latin. You don't have to, but it's a good way to practice Latin and know your prayers, which is just to say, make sure you take time every day, 20 minutes, sometimes not even 20 minutes, and pray the rosary every single day. Right, Matt?
Definitely.
If you're struggling with purity, if you're struggling with pornography, masturbation, you're struggling in your marriage, you're struggling with discouragement, depression, whatever you're struggling with, so many people say the rosary is that oasis. It's that quiet time. It's that moment when I feel at ease, and I'm sort of, the rhythm of the beads and the prayer kind of rock you into a tranquility. And so the rosary is Bible on beads. It is, no matter how bad my day's getting or how long it's been or what's going on, the rosary often is that moment where my soul takes a deep breath. And so I would encourage you, whatever's going on in your life, bring that into the rosary and you'll benefit. So pray the rosary every day, or you're not on the team. Pray the rosary. Pray the rosary for your own good and for the good of all the rest of us. And with that, I'll thank Matt Gaspers. Matt, thanks for taking time and being with us. Thanks for all your analysis on all those topics. It was great.
Thank you. You're most welcome. Look forward to our next discussion.
Sounds good. Remember, our Lord Jesus Christ said you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. So go out there and be salty. Till next time, God bless and Godspeed.